In this video, we're going to be discussing the demand curve shifters. Last video, we talked about our demand curve, which is the relationship between price and quantity. And we talked about how we can either move along this curve, have a change in quantity demanded, or how these factors can actually shift this curve. So we talked about exogenous factors, factors other than price and quantity that might cause this curve to either increase and shift to the right or decrease and shift to the left. Our exogenous, for our demand curve, we're going to talk about 6 different situations that are actually going to cause this curve to shift. So we're going to go through examples of each one of these, and as we go through the examples, one of the questions in your problem set asks you to do this as well. So please come up with your own examples based off of the ones that I'm going to be going through here. So the first we have is the first thing that can shift our demand curve is a change in income. We will look at all those situations one by one. We could have a change in the population, the change in the price of a substitute good, change in price of complements, changes in expectation of future supply, and changes in taste. So one thing I want to introduce as well is there's a distinction between normal goods and inferior goods. So a normal good, and we'll see this when we look at our income, is most goods are normal goods. Most goods, we increase our consumption as we get wealthier. Inferior goods are goods that we actually decrease our consumption as we get wealthier. So things like ramen noodles, used clothing, used cars, secondhand items, payday lending, those would all be good examples of inferior goods. So let's take a look at how these factors can actually shift our curves. So let's take an example here. Change in income. All right, let's say that this is the market for steak. Steak is a normal good. We tend to purchase more steak as we get wealthier. So what we expect here is a pretty normal market for steak. Now, what happens when our income changes? Well, if we see an income increase, then we're going to see an increase in our demand. So if our income increases, demand increases. If, on the other hand, our income decreases, so let's say you lose your job, we're probably not going to be eating a lot of steak dinners anytime soon. So if we have a decrease in income, then we have a decrease in demand. Again, a rightward shift in our demand curve represents an increase, and a leftward shift represents a decrease in demand. So these are for normal goods, but in the market for inferior goods, this is actually going to work the other way around. So let's look at that situation. Let's say instead of steak, let's look at the market for ramen noodles, which we established is an inferior good. Well, in this case, in the case of an inferior good, as our income goes up, what we're actually going to see is a decrease in demand. So as income goes up, demand for a inferior good is going to go down. And when income goes down, demand will go up for an inferior good. Income is pretty straightforward, and we see this a lot. So in terms of what I'm looking for in your problem set on your homework, this would be an example. You could tell me something like, well, this is the market for steak, this is the market for ramen, and we had a decrease in income, therefore for a normal good, we would see a decrease in demand. For an inferior good, we would see an increase in demand. Just give me your own example other than the steak and ramen example that we just went over here. But again, you'll see all of these problems in your problem set 1. Let's move on. Let's talk about our next exogenous factor that can shift our curve. Let's talk about changes in population. Changes in population are pretty straightforward. More people need more stuff. Less people need less stuff. So, an increase in the population, and it doesn't really, most goods are like this. It doesn't have a whole lot of effect on what kind of market it is, but you should always label your market. So we could pick a new example. We could say, this is the market for cars. More people purchasing cars. So an increase in the population is going to increase demand and shift our curve to the right. Whereas a decrease in our population is going to do the opposite and shift our demand curve to the left. Pretty straightforward. So the next thing on our list is the price of substitutes. So first, we have to talk about what substitute goods are. We talk about substitutes and next complements in economics a lot, and how our interaction can change based on prices of other goods. So let's look at substitutes. And let's look at 2 substitutes. Let's say that we're indifferent between apples and oranges. So our goods are apples and oranges. And these 2 goods are substitutes. Now let's look at the market. Let's say this is the market for apples. So we have to title our graph, always label. Price will always be on the vertical. Quantity will always be on the horizontal. Our demand curve is always downward sloping. And we want to label the market we're examining. So in this case, we're examining apples. Now, let's for a minute say that apples and oranges both cost $1 a piece. So per apple, $1, orange, $1. If we can consider these goods substitutes, at the same price, we're kind of indifferent between the 2 goods. Now, what happens instead if these substitutes start to change their relative prices? Let's change the price of oranges, and what we want to look at is what happens to the market for apples if we change the price of oranges. So let's assume that apples are still $1 and oranges, instead of being $1, now they're $2. Well, what's going to happen to our demand curve? Relative to apples, oranges just got a whole lot more expensive. So what's going to happen is all those people that were previously purchasing oranges are going to shift their consumption to apples. So as the price of oranges increases, so as we increase the price of oranges, the demand for apples increases. And we have a rightward shift of our demand curve. So if the substitute item becomes more expensive, then we're going to substitute into the other good. So remember, we're changing the price of oranges here, and we want to know how changing the price of oranges is going to affect our consumption of apples. Let's imagine instead that the price of oranges is now only 75 cents. Well, now relative to oranges, or relative to apples, oranges are less expensive. If individuals are indifferent between apples and oranges and they consider apples and oranges substitutes, then once we have this decrease in the price of oranges, people are going to decrease their consumption of apples and start consuming oranges again. So that will lead to a decrease in demand for apples. So an increase in the price of a substitute will increase the price of its substitute, or the demand for its substitute. A decrease in the price of a substitute is going to decrease the demand in the market. So this is a very important relationship. It's one that's studied often in economics, and we'll continue to look at this relationship between substitute goods throughout this semester. Next, we're going to look at the price of complements. So complements are goods that go well together. So we're going to use the example of peanut butter and jelly. And we're going to assume that these two goods are complements. And just like we did with our price of substitutes with apples and oranges, we're interested in what happens in the market for one good when its complement changes price. So let's take this example and let's examine the market for peanut butter. Again, price goes on the vertical, quantity goes on the horizontal. Demand curve is downward sloping because the law of demand states that as prices increase, quantity demanded decreases. And let's look at what happens to this market for peanut butter if we change the price of its complement. So let's say that the price of jelly goes up. When we're looking at this, we want to think about this in terms of we're making a sandwich. We're making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. If the jelly just got more expensive, and the jelly is a component in my sandwich, our whole sandwich just got more expensive. So an increase in the price of jelly is going to influence how people choose to buy peanut butter. So since they choose to consume them together, and again, when I say price, we're not changing the price of jelly. We're looking at a change in the price of peanut butter. So an increase in the price of jelly is going to cause a decrease in the demand for peanut butter. So an increase, price of jelly, causes a decrease in demand for peanut butter. The opposite is also true. So if, on the other hand, let's say the jelly goes on sale, then our entire sandwich just got a lot cheaper. So if the price of jelly decreases, therefore, the demand for peanut butter is going to go up. And our demand curve shifts to the right. Okay, so next we've talked about our first four. Remember, they are income, population, price of substitutes, price of complements. So now we're going to talk about the price of our expectations of future supply. Now this is one of the items, one of the variables that actually is going to end up on our supply curve as well, but they're slightly different. So what we're looking at here is we're actually talking about a little bit of both. So expectations. Let's say we have a market, price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, downward sloping demand curve. And let's look at the market for soap. This is an interesting one right now. Since we are currently in the midst of a pandemic, soap just got a whole lot more scarce, right? So what happened when everything got crazy and people started to rush the stores? Our demand increased greatly. So now in shopping for soap, now what we're kind of doing is we're expecting a lot of that supply to be gone. So our expectation about the supply of soap in the future is that we won't have the soap that we want. So what that's going to mean is if we expect supply to be low, then we're going to increase our demand today. So if our expectation for tomorrow is that there's not going to be any soap for tomorrow, it won't be available for us, then what I'm going to go and do today is I'm going to buy soap. If this is the opposite situation, if we expect the future to supply to be high, well, then we don't necessarily have to go out and get it today. Our demand can be decreased. So expectations about future supply are definitely something that we want to think about in terms of our consumer behavior. Lastly, we have a pretty straightforward demand curve shifter. We have changes in our tastes and preferences. I like to call this one fads. Let's talk about the market for fidget spinners. I remember when fidget spinners first came out and they flew off the shelf like crazy. They had a bin at the grocery store of all these spinners for $1, and within a day or two, everything was gone. And the next time I went back to the store, they were $4. And the next time after that, after those sold out, we even saw more expensive fidget spinners than that. That would be an example of a fad. So these things became really, really popular, increase in their popularity. So an increase in a fad, fads or tastes, is going to increase the demand for that good. So temporarily, the demand for fidget spinners increased. Well, after that fad passed and fidget spinners were no longer considered cool, I started getting them as free promotional items. Same quantity, same piece of equipment, and yet I'm paying less for them. So as the fad decreased, then my demand also decreased. It was no longer cool, it was no longer hip to have a fidget spinner, so they all got tossed in drawers and forgotten about, and demand decreased. These are just some of the examples, and I wanted to highlight each one of these. So when you work through your problem set, try and think of different